I'm Mike Feehan, co-director of Captain Newfoundland, and this is the True North Country Comics podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics podcast, originating in Canada and celebrating comic book and graphic novel creators and supporters. I'm John Swinimer. On this episode, I chat with Mike Feehan about Captain Newfoundland, Transmissions from the Tip of Atlantis. Mike Feehan is an illustrator from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, whose comic book credits include Star Trek and Star Trek Defiant from IDW, the GLAAD award-winning and Eisner-nominated miniseries Exit Stage Left, the Snagglepuss Chronicles from DC, as well as anthologies such as Broken Social Scene, You Forgot It in People from Z2, and Haunted Canada graphic novel Volume 2 from Scholastic. In addition to his work in comics, he also works as a storyboard artist for TV, Foundation, Apple TV+, music videos, Chainsmokers Disclosure, and commercials. Now he's co-directing the Telefilm-funded feature documentary film Captain Newfoundland. The story of Captain Newfoundland, Transmissions from the Tip of Atlantis, according to IMDb, goes like this. Media mogul, athlete, creator of the psychedelic superhero Captain Newfoundland, and activist against his home province joining Confederation, Jeff Sterling was all these things and more. To do justice to a character as complex as this film's protagonist, Mike Feehan turns the camera on himself and his co-director Jamie Miller as they weave together archival footage, animation, and fantastical recreations from Sterling's experimental 1970s late-night TV show, all very in keeping with NTV's original broadcast mission. Captain Newfoundland is an illuminating and wildly entertaining portrait of a complex man and his impact on the province that, according to Sterling, may or may not be the tip of the long-lost island of Atlantis. So, without further ado, here's my chat with Mike Feehan about Captain Newfoundland, Transmissions from the Tip of Atlantis. So, Mike Feehan, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Thank you so much for having me back on the show. Happy to talk to you.
It's been a while. I figure now might be a good time to get caught up. Before I get going with all the questions, though, I would like to know, what are you reading today?
Well, I just picked up the other day the first 2 or 3 issues of Absolute Green Arrow. I have not read it yet, but I'm really excited to. I'm a Green Arrow fan, and I've heard that it's really good, so I'm excited to check it out.
Great. Yeah, lots of good stories going on with the Absolute series from DC, and that's definitely one of them for sure.
I've been blown away by the Absolute line with DC, especially things like Absolute Batman. They seem to be blowing up. There seems to be this huge numbers in comics that it seems like it's been a while since there's been this kind of mania over comics. That's from my perspective, at least. I don't know if that's completely accurate, but I've seen the Absolute Batman stuff seems to be going wild.
Definitely. That's the word on the street these days. In fact, they're looking at maybe turning that into the next property for Batman as opposed to the traditional stuff that we've known for almost 80 years. So very interesting. We're talking today because you've taken off your comic creation hat, which most people who listen to True North Country Comics would know you from. You've now put on another hat. You're now wearing a co-director hat for a very special documentary. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, I've been working in comics for a while on and off, comics and storyboards. The last big work that I was doing in comics was for the Star Trek properties for IDW. So I'm a huge Star Trek fan, so that was a dream come true for me. It was like playing with my Next Generation action figures when I was a kid all over again. But I have always had this real passion for kind of a niche Newfoundland interest, which is this character called Captain Newfoundland. And beyond that, the guy who is kind of partially responsible for his creation, whose name was Jeff Sterling. And there's kind of a lot to explain with the context. I had to give a lot of context, but to keep it as brief as possible, there's a local TV station in Newfoundland called NTV, Newfoundland Television. It's existed since 1955. It was the first television station in Newfoundland. It started and owned by a man named Jeff Sterling, who became this multimillionaire, extremely influential figure in Newfoundland. And because he owned the station, and at the time, there was only two stations in Newfoundland for a long time, which was CBC, the national broadcaster, obviously, and then NTD, which was this private broadcaster. And Jeff had his own views on being a private broadcaster and what that allowed him to do and the liberties he wanted to take and the freedoms he wanted to have. He essentially did whatever he wanted with that station. He's someone who later in life became really interested in a lot of Eastern mysticism, Eastern spirituality, meditation, yoga, but then went on to get interested in UFOs, pyramid power, the lost city of Atlantis, conspiracy theories, all sorts of stuff. And NTV is, according to them, the first television station in the world to start broadcasting 24 hours a day. And they started this back in 1972. Part of the reason for that was because Newfoundland has a time difference of an hour and a half ahead of the Eastern time zone. So when more television stations started becoming available to Newfoundlanders in the 70s and 80s, they realized that if they went off the air when they usually were, which was midnight or 1 a.m., someone could just switch to a different American network, a Canadian network, and be watching a different channel. And he wanted people to be watching NTV all the time. So they started broadcasting 24 hours a day, but did not have enough content to meet CRTC guidelines or pay for advertising for the overnight hours. So what he came up with, it was that they would invent their own overnight programming. They called it experimental television, and it got really, really weird. Part of that experimental television experiment was the creation of a character called Captain Newfoundland, who is essentially a superhero, but he's more of like a godlike being, almost like Dr. Manhattan or like the Watcher from Marvel. He's this omnipresent, omniscient being. The whole backstory is that he's part of a race of aliens that settled the lost continent of Atlantis. There's the kind of the traditional Atlantis story that humanity became corrupted by the powers that were granted to them by the aliens or whatever, and then it sunk into the ocean. But the part of the lore that the Sterlings expanded on is that Newfoundland is actually the only remaining piece of Atlantis that remains above the ocean. Captain Newfoundland, this mystical being, watches over the island. The kind of story behind this happening was that in the late 60s, early 70s, Jeff Sterling and his son, Scott Sterling, they traveled to India. They got really into, as I said, a lot of different kind of Eastern beliefs. They studied meditation. Jeff got really interested in the writings of Ram Dass. At the time, rich white guys from Canada and the US going to India and trying to find, or from the West in general, going over to India to try to, find some sort of enlightenment was kind of trendy. And he came back to Newfoundland with all these ideas, wrote a book called In Search of a New Age, and according to him, basically no one read it. And so it was kind of a father-son collaborative effort where Scott was really into comic books, loved Superman. He presented the idea of like, Dad, what if we create a superhero character and then he's kind of the vehicle to share all of these different philosophies and ideas that we've learned and want to share with especially the people of Newfoundland. The character of Captain Newfoundland first appeared on TV, as I said, in these kind of late night experimental television segments. But then Scott really wanted to be a comic book writer through various methods. Sterling's had become very rich at that point. They ended up hiring Danny Bulanati, who was working for DC at the time, to develop Captain Newfoundland comics. And they had Boris Vallejo, who's an incredible painter, paint these amazing covers for the comics. At the time, they just started being published in the back of the local magazine that Jeff Sterling was publishing called the Newfoundland Herald, which was a weekly magazine that ultimately became like a TV guide. But every week in the back pages of the Newfoundland Herald, there would be, one page of Spider-Man, one page of the Phantom, and then there would be a page of Captain Newfoundland. And they were these incredibly beautifully drawn comics with really a bit hard to follow plots because a lot of it was Captain Newfoundland is teaching someone how to meditate, or Captain Newfoundland is explaining how to unlock each one of your chakras, or they're going to transfer their consciousnesses back in time to the birth of Christ. So it was like very unusual, very bizarre, but very niche and cool and interesting. And being someone who grew up in Newfoundland, who desperately wanted to break into the comics industry, discovering that this existed, that someone from Newfoundland had made comics, albeit a kind of unusual way. It was possible to be from there and make comics. So I kind of became obsessed with not just this character, not the fact that these comics and TV programs existed, but then when I got interested in Jeff Sterling, the man kind of behind the scenes on all of this, his life is just equally as bizarre and interesting as the character of Captain Newfoundland himself. So for the last 20 years, this has been kind of an obsession for me. And now I get to be in the position to kind of share that with the rest of Canada and the world.
Wow. I can understand why you need a film to talk about it, because that's certainly a lot of information encapsulated. So thank you for sharing that. A lot of people, and in fact, I don't know anything about Captain Newfoundland other than the title, that now you've been funded, I guess, right? Is this the deal? You're co-directing with a partner to make this message and bring this to life, right?
Yeah, so I was working with a couple of producer friends of mine named Sam Sutherland and Justin Taylor, and a friend of mine who's an incredible director and writer and brilliant creative mind named Jono Hunter. I was a storyboard artist for Jono for a long time for various commercials and other projects, and we were working on completely different Canadian content project that we were going to pitch as either a graphic novel or animated series. At some point during the process, I'd realized these guys had worked on documentary films, and they're all from Toronto. They live out here. So when I was up here for Fan Expo one year, we went out for drinks to talk about this project. And then I just kind of elevator pitched them the idea of Captain Newfoundland. Had like, basically, have you ever heard of Jeff Sterling? Because as I said, there's so many legends and myths about this guy, as well as the character of Captain Newfoundland. And they were like, no. And, we've been working in Canadian media for 20 years. How have we never heard of this guy? And the more I talked about it, the more it seemed like they were genuinely interested. And they were like, let's make this our next project. And to my kind of surprise and delight, they were all in on it. And they were like, okay, how do we make a documentary in Newfoundland? Who do we talk to? And I was like, well, I have the passion for the project. I know a lot about this subject, but I don't know what to do. So I reached out to a friend of mine named Jamie Miller, who is a Canadian Screen Award nominated director who specializes in documentary films, music videos. And I was like, hey, I would love to make a documentary about Captain Newfoundland. I have these producers on board. I think it would be a really cool idea. Who do I talk to about making this? And she was like, you should be talking to me about making this because I would love to work on this project. So we got the team together, everyone gelled, and Jamie became my co-director on this project. And so we've been working on it for 4 years now. And we applied for funding and we received development funding from Picture NL, which is a great service in Newfoundland for filmmakers, and then developed a development shoot, kind of like a sizzle reel. And we used that to secure funding from Telefilm, which was amazing. Telefilm's incredible, as well as the Canadian Media Fund. So we got the project fully funded. We started production, like official production, in March of last year. We're actually just about to completely finish the project in 2 days. Our hands are off. So it's been a very exciting process.
Sounds like it. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I know that you're still wrapping up, as you say, to get everything complete, but what are the plans for people to actually see it? Because I'm sure you want this to get in front of as many eyeballs as possible.
Yeah, so we've submitted to a bunch of film festivals. This fall will be in some in Canada that I can't announce yet, but I will say that as of today, we have just been announced as an official selection for the Atlantic International Film Festival in Halifax. So we're going to be screening Captain Newfoundland for the world premiere on September 17th in Halifax as part of the Atlantic International Film Festival. So really excited about that. And then have a few more lined up for the fall and hopefully going to have a wider release next year.
Congrats. That's great. I'm sure you're excited about that. Just going back to one of the things you mentioned about the comic itself and appearing in the Herald magazine, have there been any plans or have there been any collections of Captain Newfoundland comics that you've seen?
Yes. Going back to, so the years that these would have been started being published around 1978, 1979, in 1980 or 81 is when they started collecting them into graphic novel format. There's actually 4 editions of the Captain Newfoundland comics. And from my understanding, they were never really sold. They were more given away as promotional material. I think they really hoped that this would catch on and become like a big thing. So they have a collected edition of Captain Newfoundland Collector's Edition #1, where they collected all the pages that they published at that point into a graphic novel. Then there's another one called The Legend of Captain Atlantis, which is just some more of the stories, some different stories. And then a bit later, still in the early 80s, they developed the character of Captain Canada. So this was meant to even have like kind of wider, more mainstream appeal. This whole story it's a young man named Daniel Eaton. He's from Montreal. He's granted the powers of Captain Canada by Captain Newfoundland. And then there's this whole wonderful story where he's, again, learning how to meditate, astral project. He ends up saving the queen from a giant robot in Ottawa, and Wayne Gretzky's there. It's incredible. But that became collected into this beautiful comic just called Atlantis. And then maybe about 20 years ago, the Sterling families released a special edition of The Legend of Captain Atlantis. And I'm sorry, I should add a note that Captain Newfoundland is also known as Captain Atlantis. So that name is kind of interchangeable. So they released another special edition of Captain Atlantis. But that is to say that all of those stories have never been collected into one edition. So I would say that you should definitely, if you're interested in this, you personally, John, a friend of mine named David Stevens, he's way more informed in the comic side of this than even I am. And he has been working with NTV, the Newfoundland Herald, as well as a graphic designer named Judd Haynes, to scan all of the original pages. They've gone through like the warehouses at NTV and they found the original artwork, and they're scanning all of them. And they're currently in the process of making like almost like a coffee table book that will have all of the comics in one place, as well as interviews with creators, sketches, supplementary material, concept art, all that kind of stuff. So David would be a great person to talk to about the whole history of the comics, because there's so much stuff that he knows that I don't, because I love the comics, I love the character, but my interest kind of started really kind of focusing on Jeff Sterling and his unusual life and his broadcasting style and that kind of stuff. But the comics is a whole world that's ready to be explored. It will be out soon, I hope.
Well, that's definitely a great note for a future podcast. I'm looking forward to that. What about what's next for you? Are you working again, or is this taking up all your time? Can you work on any comic books right now?
I have a couple of projects that I'm kind of in the early stages of. I've been talking to a couple of different writers about pitches lately, but nothing is locked in yet. I also have been working on my own stuff. I'm really, after years of drawing other people's stories, I've really became interested in telling my own stories and kind of seeing what that feels like. So there's a project that I'm working on now that I'm writing and drawing. I'm hoping that we'll see the light of day in the next couple of years. But that's been kind of more my speed right now. The doc has really taken up a lot of my life. And I will say that the documentary is unusual, a bit experimental. I actually am in the documentary kind of as a way-in for the audience of someone who discovered this stuff, which on the surface seems kind of a local TV station that's mostly known for broadcast news. Then you watch it enough and it kind of feels like you're uncovering something, and you're almost like, Da Vinci Code, National Treasure kind of thing, of like, here's something on the surface, but then underneath you find this whole ton of lore and strange adventure. So I'm a character in the film, but as a comic book artist and storyboard artist, I ended up drawing a lot of stuff that appears in the film. So there's these flashbacks where we have animated storyboard sequences that I drew that kind of fill in some gaps in the story, as well as animating the character of Captain Newfoundland and having a bunch of interesting, weird, experimental sequences with my art. That's been really fun to do.
Well, it sounds like you got a lot on the go. Where do you recommend that people go online to find out about what you're doing now and in the future?
I think the best place would be my Instagram, which is at Mike Seriously. And for anything related to Captain Newfoundland, there is a Captain Newfoundland Instagram account now. I think that is just Captain Newfoundland. The production companies involved are Sea Change Films, 86 Media House. Our distribution company is Game Theory Films. So all those wonderful people are doing great stuff. Yeah, I think that's it. Instagram is the place to be. I just started a TikTok account for Captain Newfoundland as well, so hopefully things will pop up there. But for me personally, my Instagram is where I'm at.
Sounds good. Well, Mike, those are all the questions I have for you. Is there anything I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview?
If I start speaking more about Jeff Sterling himself, as I said, he had a really interesting life. I could talk for 2 hours and maybe I'll let the film do the talking. But I just recommend anyone Google Jeff Sterling, because I know the focus, obviously, your podcast, we want to be kind of highlighting the comics and that aspect of it. But there's a reason why we call the movie Captain Newfoundland. It's because this guy, Jeff Sterling, became synonymous with this character. And he became, as I said, kind of like a local legend. And you couldn't really tell what stories were true and which weren't. I mean, he's a guy who allegedly bribed guards at the pyramids of Giza to meditate in the king's chamber for 3 days while meditating and fasting in the king's chamber, and where he claims to have had an out-of-body experience, and he was injecting gold into his veins allegedly, and he was hunting aliens and sending his reporters to investigate crop circles and having exorcisms performed in his radio stations. Like just an absolutely wild, fascinating character. You could Google him and read this stuff, or you could just go see Captain Newfoundland when it's playing at a festival or a theater near you and just absorb all of that in the moment.
Thanks to Mike for the chat. You can discover more about Mike Feehan online at mikefeehan.com and on Instagram at Mike Seriously. And thank you for tuning in to the True North Country Comics podcast. I invite you to visit the True North Country Comics website to listen to even more conversations with creators about making comic books and graphic novels. You can follow along True North Country Comics on most social media platforms. And you're encouraged to send any and all feedback to True North Country Comics at proton.me. Thanks for tuning in, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2026.